People have sometimes told me that I have an odd taste in video games. I don't really think I do, to be honest, but I can understand how people might reach that conclusion. On the one hand, I deeply enjoy games like RPGs, where there's a great emphasis on story, narrative, character development, and so on. And on the other hand, I spend what many I think see as a baffling amount of time playing very expensive, very hardcore flight simulations, and among those sims, I spend much less time playing the combat-oriented ones and much more on the civilian ones. Of course, the very, very obvious answer to this question is that people are not one-dimensional, and we all have a variety of interests in life that often seemingly contradict with each other. However, rather than simply glibly stating this and leaving it at that, I decided that, you know what, I do like both of these seemingly contrasting things, rather a lot, actually. And perhaps it would make a good exercise to maybe stop and examine why that is. Perhaps if I can boil down my entire gaming diet down to its core components, I can maybe find out what the common threads are, and not only come up with an explanation, but learn a bit more about what makes me tick as a gamer. It might also explain why I've confusingly come up against a brick wall and failed to enjoy some games that, logically speaking, I probably should enjoy. Or, I'll just ramble incoherently for an entire video like I usually do. Either way, hope you enjoy it. First of all, I suppose I should examine the contradictions we're talking about. On the one hand, much of my content on this channel, and many of the games I play simply for my own entertainment, are RPGs. I've played a lot of them, and I have a pretty good idea of what makes a good one and what makes a bad one. They're typically story-driven games, narrative and character-based, and the best of them have very compelling and clearly defined stories to tell. You have goals, structure. Even in an open-world RPG like Skyrim, for example, you generally have at least some side quests knocking about to give you some reason to travel from place A to place B, so you can experience more of the world in the process, and in doing so, uncover more tasks to do. The game is designed in such a way that it constantly suggests things to the player, like, oh hey, look at this massive statue up on that mountaintop over there, but you'd like to go and see that up close, right? It does its utmost to ensure that you're never lacking for something meaningful to do, whether it's on the as on the nose as a courier handing you a letter, or something more subtle like a particularly inviting bit of world design that compels you to investigate. The game is forever throwing you opportunities to continue your own personal narrative. Other, more traditional RPGs rely on a more clearly defined plot and some fun characters to experience it with. You're pointed in a set direction, or perhaps multiple directions which can all be explored in an order of the player's choosing, but all of it has a clearly defined goal and endpoint. Contrast this with something like a flight simulator, where most other normal games will proverbially sit you down and either read you a story or thrust a list of tasks into your hand. A flight simulator is fundamentally different. There is no story. There are no overarching goals. There isn't really a very compelling world inviting you to explore it. It's just, a low-resolution planet Earth with perhaps a few token landmarks thrown in, but, mostly just consisting of automatically generated terrain that, by default at least, doesn't even look that good. This experience is almost a sandbox in its truest form. While most self-described sandbox games will actually provide some sort of overarching narrative, or simply an array of easily accessible tasks with which to structure a play, a flight sim does nothing of the sort. I say almost sandbox, but that's not really true. A sandbox would seem to imply some ability to shape the world to your own liking with a bucket and spade, if we're going to take this metaphor to the limits. Instead, a flight simulator simply throws a complex piece of virtual machinery at the player along with several hundred pieces of documentation and expects you to try and draw some kind of meaning from it yourself. Some would probably make the argument that a simulator is not really a game at all. And that'd be a fair point to make after all. Unlike the rest of video gaming as we know it, flight simulators were not invented as games. Simulators of one variety or another trace their existence as training tools back many decades before the first video game was ever commercially released. There were some pretty cool examples too, involving things like TV cameras being panned across a miniature landscape and relaying that image to a fake cockpit in which the trainee pilots would sit and view this miniature world that was blown up to full-scale size. In a bizarre way, you might consider it the first game ever made from a first-person 3D perspective. However, in the modern sense, referring more to home desktop-based simulators, they are overwhelmingly employed as a form of entertainment rather than a tool for practicing real-world operations, and therefore most definitely games, at least in the sense that I understand the term. All of this, I think, is what contributes to the slightly head-scratching attitude most people have to the genre. I have truly lost count of the number of times I've been playing such a simulator, and I've been asked the simple question, what is the point? Now, quite often, depending on the tone in which the question's been phrased, I'll simply reply by asking, what's the point of any game? It's to have fun, right? And imply that, it's actually a pretty stupid question, at least at face value anyway. It does highlight the point, though. Many people simply cannot comprehend why you would choose to engage in an activity that does not have any clearly stated goals whatsoever. I think that perhaps the majority of people who play games do require some sort of structure to have fun. Even something like Minecraft, one of the biggest seemingly structureless virtual sandboxes ever created, does have some sense of progression and even an ending of sorts. So to bring all of this back to the original question, why is it that I seem to simultaneously enjoy something totally structureless, and also something which relies wholly on narrative and a sense of tangible progression? Well, what common thread is there, if any, between these two experiences that causes me to find both compelling on similar levels? Well, after a week of thinking about it, and now looking back at what is already several paragraphs of writing, I'm beginning to think that trying to make a video on this subject was a terrible, terrible mistake, but we might as well carry on for now and see where it goes. I think the key lies in the subject of simulation itself. Almost every game is a simulation of one sort or another, but some definitely more so than others. By which I mean that they place a higher priority on simulating the subject matter they are portraying as believably as possible, and in as much detail as possible. Contrast, for example, the differences between the latest Call of Duty and a military sim like Arma. I don't think I really need to tell most of you what the differences are, but in broad strokes, while the subject matter of both is very similar, the latter is far more focused on bringing the reality of a modern battlefield to life from the comfort of your own home, while the former is much more interested in providing a pure power fantasy, and all other aspects of the experience take a back seat to that fact. When I look at the huge catalogue of games I've played over the years and pick out my favourites, like Flight Simulator, the Elder Scrolls series, the Total War series, Stalker, Hearts of Iron, Crusader Kings, Thief, Dwarf Fortress, Homeworld, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, Hidden and Dangerous, The Sims, Deus Ex, Age of Empires, Fallout, Silent Hunter, XCOM, Kerbal Space Program, King of Dragon Pass, Metro 2033, The Witcher, and a really huge number of others too, but those are the only ones I can think of off the top of my head. The commonality that I see between all of them is that they seem to be games that place a high priority on the simulation of some sort. While many of them obviously have other defining features like telling huge stories, in the case of games like The Witcher or Fallout, or in the case of Age of Empires or Total War games where providing a challenging game of what is basically real-time chess is the chief goal. However, all of them go one step further than providing just that alone. They're games that ask the question, what exactly would it be like to experience this for real? And how can we simulate that experience as completely as possible in our own game? Let's be clear about one thing here, by the way. I'm not talking necessarily about immersion here. That's different. Immersion, if anything, is more of a byproduct of this attitude towards simulation, in my opinion, and crucially only really applies to 3D games where the player controls a single character, usually from a first-person perspective. Immersion is something I really do value in a game for sure, but it doesn't represent a common thread between all of this. You can't really describe something like Kerbal Space Program, for example, as immersive, in my opinion. Or maybe you can. Maybe the two terms are interchangeable, but just for the sake of argument right now, I'm going to treat them as separate. Let's look at a few examples of games that do this whole simulation thing well, examine the why and the how behind them, and after that we'll examine a few games that I've personally not really gelled with in the past and see if maybe all of this has something to do with it. Let's begin with Stalker, specifically the original title Shadow of Chernobyl, since I haven't yet played the others. Stalker, in a nutshell, for those not familiar, is a first-person shooter in a semi-open world consisting of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, set after a second, far more bizarre and dangerous nuclear accident. It's primarily inspired by a film of the same name and a book called Roadside Picnic, in addition to the real-world Chernobyl incident itself. Stalker is a game primarily praised for its atmosphere. It spends an awful lot of time and effort trying to immerse the player fully in the world of the zone. First through its visual design, which includes many locations accurately reconstructed from locations in the real world, and what was for the time a very impressive lighting engine. The way your flashlight illuminated and cast long shadows across murky interiors and nighttime exteriors not only looked visually gorgeous, but contributed to the feeling of horrifying claustrophobia as your vision was squeezed down into a single cone of light that extended only a couple dozen feet in front of you. It also had incredible sound. The wind, the rain, the sound of distant barking mutants all pulled you into the experience in a way I don't think I can recall any other game having done to me previously. As night falls, in addition to your visual experience becoming more narrowed and the gameplay more hazardous, the zone seems to come alive with blood-curdling screams and shrieks that are not present during the day. And it's never really made clear what the source of those sounds is. Mutants? Ghosts? Or is it simply the zone itself making a conscious effort to mess with your head? The zone is portrayed both indirectly through the player's experiences and also through the plot as being more than simply a few radioactive scrapyards with a nuclear power plant at the centre. It's alive. The zone is like the body of some colossal alien being, and the mutants, the anomalies and other dangers represent antibodies attempting to expel the bacteria that is human interference. There is a main story, but it serves as little more than a device to give the player objectives across the map, which will ultimately guide them through every area of the zone available to them. The primary purpose of the game seems to simply be to say, hey, player, look at this amazing twisted pocket of man-made hell we've created. Come and live in it for a while and see what you think. And when I say live in it, I really mean it. The player has to scavenge food to eat, alcohol and drugs to stave off the effects of a radiation exposure, more ammunition for their weapon of choice, and there are a lot of guns and ammo types to choose from. And eventually, some artifacts or other items that can be sold to traders and other stalkers in the zone in order to turn a bit of a profit. The constant cycle of going out into the zone, exploring, fighting whatever jumps out from behind the corners you find, scavenging what you can, selling it, and returning to some sort of relatively safe refuge to wait out the night, creates a strange sense of routine in a world full of chaos. You begin to consciously adapt to the zone as you play, and as you go on, you feel less like a bewildered outsider and start to view the rusty hellscape as home. The other stalkers are family now. They even refer to you as brother from time to time, and you feel a very distinct sense of loss when you discover the corpse of someone who you traded a pack of cigarettes with only the previous day. You begin to get a very distinct taste of the post-Soviet malaise common to countries that were former members of the Soviet Union. Hard, tired men in tracksuits gather around makeshift campfires to reminisce about earlier days, all the time surrounded by the rusting graveyard of monuments to the Soviet era, a time cloaked in nostalgia for many that live in those countries. Now, all that's left is some crumbling buildings with rusty hammer and sickle iconography on their rooftops, filled with sad and desperate people picking through the remains for scraps. The end of the Soviet Union must have felt like the end of the world for many who lived in it. In the West, we see it as an overwhelmingly positive thing, and for good reasons too. But we often overlook the catastrophic effect it had on the very poorest people in that country at the time. That sense of nostalgia, sadness, desperation and poverty is bottled up and distilled down to a very concentrated level in Stalker for the player to experience within the scope of a simple video game. But what's remarkable is that you're never beaten over the head by it. You're not once lectured on the subject by any NPC or piece of writing in the game at all. Instead, it's captured by the experience as a whole, by the zone as a whole, and leaves its mark on the player like a fingerprint. All of this, I feel, is owed to the way the game takes the simulation of its subject matter seriously. It isn't enough to simply show you the zone like a theme park ride. You're forced to live in it and experience it firsthand. Everything about the game, from the visuals and the audio to the way the animals and the ecosystem of the zone behave, to the brutal and realistically quick gunplay, serve to create a well-rounded simulation of a uniquely Eastern European post-apocalypse, with everything else coming second in priority. Now let's switch focus to a different kind of game altogether, Dwarf Fortress. At GDC 2016, Tarn Adams, the creator of Dwarf Fortress, in a speech, said words to the effect that he was about 42% done simulating existence. You may be thinking, therefore, that this part of the video is going to be pretty on the nose when it comes to discussing the simulation aspect of the game, and yeah, it will be, but for good reason. Dwarf Fortress is ostensibly a game in which you build and manage, well, a dwarf fortress full of dwarves. It's a simple concept, but it's the execution that makes it staggering. When you start the game, you have to generate a world first that your fortress can then be built in. You're presented with a set of variables that you can tweak, and then the generation begins, and what happens is kind of incredible. The game procedurally builds the planet on which the gameplay will occur. It creates rocks, trees, seas, continents, rivers, mountains, and then settlements. Sentient beings, which form tribes and nations, which then go to war with each other, and form empires and, carve up the world between them. Generations pass, the auto-generated NPC characters and their exploits become myths and legends, which in turn continue to determine the form and culture of civilizations, and ultimately, the world that you'll have to interact with when you begin the construction of your fortress. When this is done, you then pick a point on the map that displays a preferable amount of resources and minerals for a successful fortress to live on. You assemble a team of dwarves with equipment and skills of your choice, and then embark. A screen pops up and instructs you in no uncertain terms to strike the earth. Here, the main game itself begins, and you oversee the construction of your dwarves' new home, and assuming it doesn't fall prey to any number of hazards which include, but are not limited to, flooding, starvation, volcanic eruption, madness, an infestation of vampires, demonic invasion, and I shit you not, a massive explosion of the domestic cat population referred to those who play the game as a catsplosion. Your dwarves are not simple minions like the imps from Dungeon Keeper, however. They are people. They have personalities, motivations, extended families. They worship different gods, seek different sources of meaning in their lives. When you command the building of a statue in the game, it isn't a meaningless piece of decoration. The statue will be of something or someone, either depicting a person or an event from history that is particularly relevant to the dwarf who was given the task of creating the statue. Dwarf Fortress is a huge collection of mechanics which, together, manage to form a jaw-dropping simulation of a fantasy universe, 100% procedurally generated at the touch of a button. What many writers spend years trying to accomplish, Dwarf Fortress does using a computer in seconds. All these mechanics interact with each other in perfect harmony, weaving a reality that is utterly believable thanks to its depth. As an example of how this works in practice, take this. In a patch, a while ago, they introduced taverns to the game. Dwarves can go to these taverns to sing, dance, drink, and generally have a good time. They'll listen to poetry, which you can actually read for yourself, and which will again be procedurally generated based on events, people, and gods that exist in the game world. What began to happen after this patch was introduced was that pets like cats would start dying a lot more often once the taverns were introduced. Why was this? Well, essentially what would happen was the dwarves would drink and dance, and in doing so spill their alcohol on the floor. A cat would then wander in, start drinking the spilled beer and wine on the floor, and in doing so get completely drunk, and then go on to die in hilarious ways as a result of the alcohol. I don't think I need to say much more, really. Simulation lies at the heart of Dwarf Fortress. It's the concept the whole game is built around. It's what makes its world believable, and the struggles and toils of the dwarves in their fortress feel so realistic. And it's why the frequent mishaps, deaths, and screw-ups are so entertaining. Like the time one of my dwarves accidentally buried the carcass of a sheep in a noble tomb, and the dead noble in question was thrown out on the refuse pile with the dead livestock. This noble, by the way, was killed because he went stir-crazy and attacked his fellow dwarves, one of which literally tore off one of his arms and beat him to death with it. Something that absurd and hilarious could not result in a game that did not provide such a detailed and complex simulation of a fantasy world. A mad variable leading to a situation like that would simply not be permitted to exist in a simpler game that did not take such an anal attitude to simulating everything down to the type of dirt the dwarves are walking around on. It's the source of what makes the game great, and simultaneously is why so many games that have attempted to copy Dwarf Fortress and put it in a more user-friendly format have failed, because they completely missed the point of what makes Dwarf Fortress such a compelling experience in the first place. Finally, let's look back at flight simulators. There are quite a few out there. Microsoft Flight Simulator X being probably the most famous, but there's also X-Plane, DCS World, IL-2 Sturmovik, and a ton of others. But they all do essentially the same thing, and so it's easier just to talk about them as a group rather than one title in particular for the purposes of this discussion. They do what it says on the tin. They simulate flight, and all the many machines required to make that happen. There's no purpose to this other than to allow the player to experience what it might be like to do it in the real world. In other words, it's simulation in the purest dictionary-defined form, hence the word itself is in the title. What is provided to you in the form of both the base experience and the thousands upon thousands of add-ons available for the simulators is planet Earth on a one-to-one scale, along with weather, a day and night cycle, and they all mimic the real world. In excruciating detail at times too, you can use real-world weather, which will, using weather data generated and gathered from stations across the world and downloaded via the internet, structure the weather in-game to match exactly what you can see out of your window. The scale matches the real world too. If it takes you 3 hours to fly a jumbo jet from one city to another in the real world, it will take the same amount of time to do in the sim. All of this is great, but it would be useless without the aircraft themselves, and again, the player is well catered for. Aircraft, depending on how good a job the developers did, of course, act and fly like their real-world counterparts. Their systems and mechanics mimic the real ones down to the most minute details. For example, if you fly a particular jumbo jet for long enough, you will notice that the amount of hydraulic fluid and the oil levels slowly begin to drop, and will eventually need refilling. It gets to a point where, particularly when it comes to modern aircraft, which have extensive computer systems of their own, it goes beyond simulation and starts to stray into the world of emulation, with the computer software of the real jet planes being recreated on your desktop computer for you to interact with. All of this requires serious computing power to accomplish, and as a result, flight simulators are frequently some of the most demanding pieces of software available for home computers. They might not look like much, but I can guarantee you that even if your rig can run Crysis 3 on Macs, Flight Simulator X with some complex add-ons will kick your PC's arse 6 ways to Sunday. Now, of course, if you have no interest in aircraft or aviation at all, these games will hold very little interest for you, but if you do, they're some of the most engaging and complex gaming experiences you will ever encounter, comparable only really with something like Dwarf Fortress in terms of complexity and depth, and learning curve too, come to think of it. Learning how it all works on a platform that is faithful enough to its real-world counterparts to be used as a training tool is quite an accomplishment. The knowledge you gain and your increasing ability to pilot the aircraft in the sim has an intoxicating effect, not only because the mechanical exercise itself is rewarding, but because everything you've learned has a real-world application. If nothing else, it will transform the act of getting on a plane for your holidays irreversibly forever. The feeling of having mastered such an impenetrably difficult piece of virtual machinery is almost incomparable. The closest thing I can think of would be perhaps beating a particularly difficult boss in Dark Souls, but it's still not quite the same. The idea that you've come as close as you can to flight without actually having to spend a fortune and a quarter of a lifetime learning how to do it for real, and then devoting yourself to it as a career, is an exciting thing. And it can be immersive as hell too. In fact, it would be hard not for it to be when it's surrounded with that level of complexity. The attention to detail, the systems, the sounds, the controls, the visuals, the real-world weather and time all together manage to transport you totally into the role of the pilot. You can also take the simulator online using networks like VATSIM, where you can fly with hundreds of other virtual pilots and air traffic controllers who learn and employ the same procedures their real-world counterparts do. It's a rare example of multiplayer in a game being used in a way that actually adds to the realism, immersion, and integrity of the simulation as a whole, rather than detracting from it. Now, I could go on and analyze virtually every game on the list I read off earlier in this video, but to do so would take hours upon hours of time, so I'm not going to bother. However, I would encourage you to look at those games and any others that you can think of and examine how they use simulation to enhance the experience in different ways. Looking at all my favourite games, this aspect seems to be the thing they all hold in common. And I believe that it's why I find them such enjoyable experiences, even though some of them are certainly flawed in many ways, like Skyrim with its laughable main story and fairly dull combat, and Dwarf Fortress with its horrible user interface and terrifying learning curve. And speaking of flawed games, I'm going to take this last section of the video to look at an example of a game that is considered a classic by many, and one that I thought I would enjoy going into it, but ended up never really connecting with it very well. That game is Boulders Gate. Boulders Gate is an RPG developed by BioWare and Black Isle and released in 1998. It's the archetypal party-based computer role-playing game from which many titles, including BioWare's huge lineage of games, draw their inspiration from. I got into the game many years after it was originally released, after seeing some gameplay of it and hearing the mountains of praise people had for the series. As it turns out, most of that praise was actually directed at the game's sequel, but nevertheless I decided to try it a number of times. Once, I even attempted to record it as a Let's Play, and another time I tried streaming it live on Twitch. Both playthroughs ended without having finished the game, after becoming tired of the experience and wanting to move on to other things instead. To this day, I've never finished Boulders Gate, and as a result of a personal obsession of mine with completing a game entirely before moving on to its sequel, I've never played its critically acclaimed second installment either. Why didn't Boulders Gate click with me then? There are a number of reasons, really. The game definitely has its flaws, and when approaching it as a modern gamer, there are some challenges to overcome. Not in the least its ancient user interface and rule system. However, that alone wasn't the problem, clearly, since one of my favourite games of all time is Planescape Torment, and that game suffers from all of the same problems. I think the underlying issue may be that Baldur's Gate never really managed to draw me in. I was never able to feel immersed in its world and sink hours of time into it in the way I can with similar titles. The game did a poor job of simulating the experience of actually being in its world, that of the Forgotten Realms Dungeons & Dragons setting, and believe me, I wanted to be dragged in. The Forgotten Realms is one of my favourite fantasy settings. Many of the games set in its world I have thoroughly enjoyed, and I've read a large number of the books by authors like R.A. Salvatore that are set in that world. The reason for this failure, I think, boils down to a simple problem that was highlighted to me when I watched a video on the subject of the Baldur's Gate series by Noah Caldwell-Gervais. A link will be in the description, by the way, as it's an extremely worthwhile watch, in my opinion. The issue is that Baldur's Gate isn't trying to simulate the experience of being in the Forgotten Realms as its primary goal at all. Instead, it's trying to simulate the experience of playing a tabletop game of Dungeons & Dragons. That certainly is the only reason I can think of for the game using the mind-bogglingly bass-ackwards 2nd edition D&D rule set, instead of coming up with something more streamlined and appropriate for a digital game. I won't bore you with the details here, but just trust me when I say the way the stats and combat works in 2nd edition D&D is just weird, to say the least. So in a nutshell, the actual experience of being a person exploring the Sword Coast takes a back seat to the attempted simulation of a game of Dungeons & Dragons. The problem there, aside from the obvious one, is that it doesn't even seem to simulate that particularly well. If you've ever played a tabletop RPG, you'll know that one of the most important and enjoyable things about it is the shared group experience. The role-playing, banter, and general fun that you as a group have is a central part of the game, and without that, it's just a series of dice rolls and not much else. Baldur's Gate attempts to make up for the lack of other players and a dungeon master by providing computer-controlled equivalents. You have party members that follow you on your adventure as a group, much in the same way you would in a tabletop game, but crucially, they never really say anything, ever. You get a bit of conversation with them and maybe a quest when you're introduced to them, but after that they rarely have anything to say beyond the occasional combat soundbite or offhanded muttering. It's not often that you have any real conversations as a group about the task at hand as you would in a real game of D&D. As a result, the game really is boiled down to a very undynamic experience consisting mostly of combat, which itself isn't very exciting, and exploration of fairly bland outdoor maps. For a game based on Dungeons & Dragons, it's actually quite notable for its lack of dungeons. There are a few, and they are actually quite memorable. Arguably, this is actually where the game is at its best, even with its dodgy pathfinding issues. The game's story isn't particularly well written either, and the same goes for the villain as well. But neither of those things are particularly important to the tabletop experience either, so it comes as no real surprise. Thankfully, BioWare and Black Isle's later games remedied this problem, and the sequel, although I've not played it myself beyond the opening dungeon, is known for its lively and talkative party members, and an outstanding villain. Planescape Torment, which I mentioned earlier, is a similarly excellent experience. Ultimately, I suppose it could be argued that trying to replicate an experience as truly dynamic as a tabletop RPG on a computer was maybe a bit of a fool's errand, and perhaps it was, but kudos for trying anyway, and we got some great games out of it in the end later down the line. Perhaps, though, if Baldur's Gate had dispensed with the pretense of trying to create a digital pen and paper experience, and instead focused more on developing the mood and mechanics of the world along with the players' interactions with it, it might have produced a better game, or at least a game that I personally would have found more engaging. In other words, if they'd tried simulating the Sword Coast instead of simulating a board game set on the Sword Coast, I probably would have liked it more. We all look for different things in the games we play, and we all have our preferences. Some people look for challenge and difficulty above all else, and those would be the Counter-Strike and Dark Souls players amongst us. Others, like me, look for escapism first and foremost, to be transported entirely to another world, become totally immersed in it and forget that I'm playing a game at all is the ultimate goal I'm looking for when I pick up any game, whether it's an RPG, strategy, first-person shooter, or even a farming simulator. It's one of the things that I think games manage to do better than any other piece of media. If I have to sit down and watch a movie that's longer than about 3 hours, I start to get restless. If I read a book for more than a few hours, I inevitably start to fall asleep sometimes, but regularly I've sat down to play a video game and only stopped when I looked out the window and noticed that it's starting to get light out again. The detailed simulation of another world, even if that world looks very similar to our own, in the case of a flight simulator, is the thing I enjoy most about games. It's why I love the Elder Scrolls games, even though they're not strictly speaking the best RPGs ever made. It's why I love Flight Sim, even though it has so many extremely boring components to it. It's why I think Hearts of Iron is brilliant, even though I terribly suck at it. And it's why I think Dwarf Fortress is a masterpiece, even though it frequently makes my head explode. Or possibly because it makes my head explode, I'm not really sure. Anyway, my name is SorcererDave, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't do these kind of scripted videos very often, to be honest with you. I generally tend to stick to the live commentary style of things. But every now and again, I do like to make a video like this, and I think I'm looking to make more of them in the future as well. You guys can let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll take that on board and see what I can do when I'm making the next video. But I have a feeling that if I hadn't used a script, this would have been a hell of a lot longer and a hell of a lot more waffly, I think, to be honest. So anyway, that's about it. Maybe you guys have similar opinions. Maybe you guys look for other things that are different in games, first and foremost. If that's the case, tell me what those are in the comments. I'd be genuinely interested to find out, actually. So anyway, that was it from me, and I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.